Bikers humiliate and spit in elderly black man's coffee, unaware he's a Vietnam veteran. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Mr. James Carter, a quiet elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face, sat alone in the corner of his favorite diner. He had been coming here for years, always ordering the same thing, a black coffee, no sugar. It was his morning ritual, a small moment of peace in a world that had grown louder and less familiar with time. The old man had seen a lot in his life, more than most could ever imagine, but he never spoke much about it. He preferred to keep to himself, never drawing attention, never causing trouble. The bell above the diner's door jingled, breaking the peaceful morning silence. A group of bikers, loud and rowdy, stomped in, their heavy boots clunking against the tiled floor. The leader, a tall man with a scruffy beard and tattoos running down his arms, scanned the room with a smirk before locking eyes on Mr. Carter. To them, he looked like an easy target. Just another old man, sitting alone, minding his business, the kind they could mess with for their own amusement. They strutted over to his table, their presence looming over him like a dark cloud. Mr. Carter didn't look up, didn't acknowledge them. He simply lifted his coffee cup, bringing it to his lips, as if their intrusion meant nothing. That seemed to irritate them. "Hey, old man," the leader sneered, yanking out a chair and plopping down across from him. "Didn't your mama teach you to say hello?" His friends chuckled, already enjoying whatever was about to happen. But Mr. Carter remained calm, his expression unreadable. He had faced far worse than a few loudmouthed bikers in his lifetime. One of them grabbed a salt shaker from the table and poured a heap into Mr. Carter's coffee, laughing as they did. Another picked up the cup, swirling the liquid before bringing it close to his lips. "You sure you want to drink this, Grandpa?" he taunted, before spitting right into the cup. The group erupted in laughter, pounding the table like a pack of hyenas. To them, it was a harmless joke, just something to pass the time and make themselves feel big. They expected the old man to shrink away, to cower, to mumble something, and walk out, defeated. But he didn't. Instead, Mr. Carter slowly set the cup back down. His fingers didn't tremble. His eyes didn't waver. For the first time, he lifted his head and looked directly at them. There was something in his gaze, something cold, something that made the laughter die down just a little. The leader cleared his throat, trying to shake off the sudden shift in energy. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" But Mr. Carter wasn't looking at him anymore. His gaze had drifted to the patches on the man's leather vest, a military insignia, a symbol he recognized all too well. "You wear that with pride, son?" Mr. Carter asked, his voice steady. The biker scoffed, glancing down at his own jacket. "Damn right I do. My old man was in the service. I wear this to honor him." There was a brief silence, and then, with an eerie calmness, Mr. Carter leaned forward. "Then I wonder," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what he'd think of you now?" The words hit harder than expected. The leader's face twitched, as if something deep inside him had been rattled. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the diner's owner, an older woman who had been watching from behind the counter, spoke up. "James," she called out, stepping forward. "I think it's time you tell them." Mr. Carter sighed. He had never been one for stories, never cared to share his past with strangers. But something about the moment, about the ignorance in these young men's eyes, made him change his mind. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small battered card. He slid it across the table. The leader picked it up, frowning as he read the words, "United States Marine Corps. Vietnam War veteran, Purple Heart recipient." The color drained from the biker's face. He blinked, as if his mind was struggling to catch up with what he had just read. The old man before him wasn't just some frail retiree. He was a soldier, a survivor, a man who had faced war, who had watched friends die, who had endured things these bikers could never comprehend. The diner fell silent. The laughter was gone. The arrogance had vanished. Even the toughest of the group shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact with Mr. Carter. For a long moment, no one spoke, and then, with slow precision, Mr. Carter took back his card and tucked it into his pocket. He picked up his ruined coffee, stood up, and without another word, walked toward the exit. The bikers didn't try to stop him. They just sat there, staring after him, their expressions frozen somewhere between shame and disbelief. But that wasn't the end of it. Days later, when the story of what had happened in the diner spread, it reached more ears than anyone could have expected. And soon, it led to a moment no one, especially the bikers, could have ever imagined. Because the next time they saw Mr. Carter, it wasn't at the diner, it was in a courtroom. And when the truth was finally revealed, it left the entire room gasping in shock. The days that followed were heavy with an uneasy silence. The bikers, once so full of pride and arrogance, found themselves haunted by what had happened in that diner. They had thought they were just messing with some old man, someone too weak to stand up for himself. But now, knowing who he really was, shame sat on their shoulders, like a weight they couldn't shake. Word of the incident spread through town faster than they could have imagined. At first, it was just whispers among the regulars at the diner. But soon, it reached local newspapers, then social media. People were furious. How could they do something so cruel to a veteran, a man who had sacrificed so much for his country? The leader of the bikers, whose name was Travis, felt the weight of it more than anyone. He had grown up with stories of his father's service, had worn his military patches as a sign of respect, but now he felt like a fraud. He could still see the look in Mr. Carter's eyes, that steady, unshaken gaze that had seen things Travis could never imagine. And the worst part, Mr. Carter hadn't even needed to fight back. He didn't raise his voice, didn't get angry. His silence had been more powerful than any punch. Then came the news that shook everything even more. A lawsuit had been filed. Travis and his crew had been summoned to court. At first, they didn't understand what kind of charges could be brought against them. They hadn't laid a hand on the old man, but then the reality hit. The public humiliation, the verbal abuse, the clear act of disrespect toward a decorated war veteran. The case wasn't just about a cup of coffee anymore. It was about something bigger. By the time the court date arrived, the whole town was talking. Reporters showed up outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, microphones in faces. The bikers tried to keep their heads down, but there was no avoiding it. They had become the villains of the story. And then there was Mr. Carter. He walked into the courtroom the same way he had walked out of the diner, calm, steady, unshaken. He didn't have an expensive lawyer. He didn't have a crowd of people surrounding him. He just had himself, a quiet presence that somehow filled the room. When the judge entered, the room settled. The case was officially underway. The prosecutor stood and began laying out what had happened. Witnesses were called up, people who had been in the diner that day. The waitress spoke first, her voice firm as she recalled the way the bikers had laughed, how they had spit in the old man's coffee. Others followed, painting a picture of the event that made the bikers sink lower in their seats. And then it was Mr. Carter's turn. The courtroom went silent as he stood. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a man seeking revenge. He just looked tired. He took a deep breath before speaking. "I've seen a lot in my life," he began, his voice steady. Things that keep a man awake at night. Things that no one should have to see. I didn't ask for a war. None of us did. But we went. We did what we had to do. And when we came back, we didn't ask for much. Just a little respect. A little peace. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I don't care about the coffee, he continued. I don't care about the insults. But what I do care about is the fact that these young men, he turned slightly toward the bikers, who now couldn't even meet his eyes, don't understand the weight of their actions. They wear symbols of honor, but they don't understand what honor really means. Travis swallowed hard. His stomach twisted. The judge listened closely, nodding as Mr. Carter spoke. When he finished, there was a long silence. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, the judge turned to the bikers. Do you have anything to say for yourselves? Travis hesitated. His throat felt dry, but then, slowly, he stood. I was raised to respect men like Mr. Carter, he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard from him before. I thought I understood what service meant, what sacrifice meant, but I didn't. And now, I can see that. The judge studied him for a moment, then nodded. Mr. Carter, the judge said, turning back to him, what is it that you want from this case? The room waited. The tension thickened. People were expecting punishment, maybe even jail time. For the bikers, some thought Mr. Carter would demand financial compensation. But instead, the old man sighed and spoke 4 words that no one saw coming. I want them to learn. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge seemed slightly surprised. You mean community service? The judge asked. Mr. Carter shook his head. No. I want them to come with me, to the veterans' home, to hear stories from men who lived through what I did, to look them in the eye and see what real sacrifice means. The courtroom gasped. No one had expected that. The bikers exchanged uncertain looks. Spending time with old veterans, listening to war stories, they weren't sure what to think. But Travis knew. He knew that this was a second chance. And so, after a long pause, he nodded. We'll do it. The judge considered for a moment, then banged the gavel. Then it settled. And just like that, the course of their lives changed. Forever. They had walked into the courtroom as bullies. But by the time they walked out, they had no idea they were about to embark on a journey that would transform them in ways they never expected. A week later, Travis and his crew found themselves standing in front of the local veterans' home, shifting uncomfortably. They had been to a lot of places, bars, rallies, long open highways, but never a place like this. The building was old but well kept, with an American flag waving gently outside. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and something faintly medicinal. Carter was already there, waiting for them. He gave them a slow nod, then turned and walked inside. No words, no lectures, just an expectation that they would follow. And they did. Inside, the walls were lined with faded photos. Men in uniform, young and strong, frozen in time. Some black and white, some color. All of them telling a story. Travis caught sight of a picture of a group of soldiers in the jungle, their faces covered in sweat and dirt. The caption read, Vietnam, 1968. He swallowed hard. The group was led into a common room where several elderly veterans sat in chairs, some in wheelchairs, others staring out of the windows as if lost in thought. One by one, the bikers took their seats, unsure of what was about to happen. And then, the stories began. Mr. Carter started, but soon others joined in. Stories of war, of loss, of nights spent in foxholes, hearts pounding as explosions shook the ground, of brothers in arms who never made it home, of coming back to a country that had forgotten them, that treated them like criminals instead of heroes. Travis listened, really listened, for the first time in his life. He felt something tighten in his chest as one veteran described losing his best friend in an ambush. Another man, his voice shaking, talked about the fear that never really went away. Even decades later, for the first time, the bikers saw beyond the medals and uniforms. They saw the pain, the sacrifices, the unspoken grief. They saw men who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. By the end of the day, something had shifted. The bikers, who had walked in as outsiders, left feeling something they had never expected: respect, not just for Mr. Carter, but for every man in that room. Over the next few weeks, they kept coming back, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They played cards with the vets, listened to their stories, even helped around the facility. Little by little, the walls they had built around themselves started to crumble. One evening, as Travis sat across from Mr. Carter, he finally spoke the words he had been holding in. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "for what we did that day." Mr. Carter looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "I know," he said simply. That was it. No long speech, no dragging out the past, just understanding. When the bikers agreed upon time at the veterans' home ended, something unexpected happened. They didn't stop coming. They had formed bonds, connections they never thought possible, and the lessons they learned stayed with them, changing the way they carried themselves, the way they treated others. One day, Mr. Carter walked into the diner and found Travis sitting there alone, sipping a black coffee, no sugar. He smirked at the sight. "You drink it like that now?" he asked, taking a seat. Travis chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I do." They sat in silence for a moment before Travis spoke again. "You changed us," he admitted. "We thought we were tough before, thought we had the right to act like we did, but we didn't know a damn thing about real strength." Mr. Carter nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Real strength isn't about how loud you are," he said. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away." Travis exhaled slowly, taking in the words. That was the last time they spoke. But it wasn't the last time Travis thought about Mr. Carter. The old man had given him something more valuable than a lesson. He had given him a new perspective, a chance to be better. Years later, when Mr. Carter passed away, the funeral was packed, not just with family, but with bikers, veterans, and townspeople who had come to show their respect. As the honor guard folded the American flag and handed it to his family, Travis stood off to the side, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that diner all those months ago. He had learned something that day, something he carried with him ever since, and as he turned to leave, he made himself a silent promise: to live with honor, to carry respect, and to never forget the man who had taught him the true meaning of both.